Hi Year 13. Hopefully by now we have had our live lesson and you've received feedback on your essays from a couple of weeks ago. Well done for those, they were really good, and I'll cover more of that obviously in our live lesson. In this lesson, I would like us to finish revising Act 2 of Top Girls, and by the end of today we should have looked at the play as a whole then, and we'll be able to start to move forward to producing some exam style responses, which, as you know, are really important in terms of me being able to give a good and accurate judgment of your grades. So in this lesson, we're going to cover the rest of the events of Act 2, and we're going to focus particularly on the importance of Mrs. Kidd, because I think, though she doesn't appear in a lot of the play, she's a very minor character. In terms of her plot function and symbolic function, she's really important. So we're going to do a lot of work on her today and almost give her a lesson in itself. Also, we're going to look at the language of gender again, and I'm going to remind you of Churchill's language choices that reflect something about society, and I think is still poignant in today's society as well. We'll continue to look at conflict between women, because that seems to be a big idea in Churchill's play, that the rise of the new woman and the second wave of feminism actually led to lots of conflict between women. And we're also going to look at representation of men in the play, remembering that there are no male characters, but the references to them do still offer some insight into men in society. Okay, so the events of the rest of the act then. So Angie arrives at the office to surprise Marlene, but Marlene is busy, and there's a sense that Angie is inconveniencing Marlene in some way. Angie clearly idolises Marlene, but Marlene seems to be fairly cold towards her and only really offers her kind of small talk and questions about when she's going home. Angie falls asleep in the office, and this seems to symbolise the idea that she's not suited to an office environment, that that isn't part of Angie's trajectory in life, that she won't make it to that kind of working environment. And then Mrs. Kidd arrives at the end of the act to talk to Marlene, and we'll look at that in more detail as we go through. So then, remember that Top Girls is a play, and we're supposed to analyse it as a work of theatre. What do you notice in all of these like clippings, if you like, from representations of the play from different directors? What do you notice about the difference between Marlene and Mrs. Kidd? Hopefully, just by looking at these pictures and given what you know about the play, you'll be able to identify quickly which actor is playing Marlene and which actor is playing Mrs. Kidd. What do you notice about the difference between the two women? Okay, move forward now. How do you think that Churchill intended for directors to immediately establish a dichotomy between these two characters? So the playwright gives the words and the vision to a director, and a director brings that to life. How do you think that that Churchill would have intended for directors to represent Marlene as being very different to Mrs. Kidd? Remember that that word dichotomy there means a stark difference between the two characters, and you couldn't get two more different characters than Marlene and Mrs. Kidd. How did Churchill want directors to represent the difference? Pause and think about that and write down your thoughts. Okay, so first and foremost, one of the clear differences between the characters is in the way that they dress. So we've looked at the importance of dress as part of a person's identity. We looked at the idea of gender performativity as well, which was led by Judith Butler when we were in class. Now, I think it's very clear that directors would have wanted Marlene to power dress, to dress in those very smart office clothes, and that's immediately established in these things. I think it's quite interesting in the top photo particularly. Let me see if I can highlight the one I'm talking about so that you're definitely on the same page as me. This one here and this one here, both directors have Marlene sitting down and Mrs. Kidd standing up, reflecting the idea that Marlene is very comfortable in an office environment and Mrs. Kidd doesn't feel very comfortable at all. It's reflected in the body language as well. So here particularly, Mrs. Kidd is kind of covering her body. She's got quite closed body language to show that she feels a sense of insecurity. So a director's job would be to show to the audience visual differences between the two characters. And I think that's important to think about in terms of establishing the differences between those two characters and Mrs. Kidd's outlook on her position in society. And these quotations here, I think, reveal something about Mrs. Kidd's feelings of her position in society. As I read these to you, I would like you to think about what they show about how Mrs. Kidd feels about herself, her own sense of belonging, her self-esteem, etc. So she says, excuse me bursting in on you like this. And then she says, you don't recognise me, but we did meet. I remember you, of course, but you wouldn't. Now, that forward slash there shows us that she's then to be interrupted by Marlene. So Marlene interrupts her a lot, reflecting the sense of power that Marlene feels that she has over Mrs. Kidd. Then she says, I'm very sorry. It's a matter of some urgency. She also says, I'm sorry if I'm interrupting your work. I know office work isn't like housework. So the thing that strikes me about all of these quotations is that Mrs. Kidd continually apologises for herself. She has to say excuse me 3 times before she begins to say why she's interrupted Marlene. She says, I'm very sorry, and I'm sorry, which immediately shows that she positions herself beneath Marlene in terms of power. Now remember that Mrs. Kidd is a housewife. She reflects a more traditional ideology. She hasn't become a top girl in any way. Her identity is very much attached to Howard, her husband. Even the part where she says, you don't recognise me, but we did meet. I remember you, of course, but you wouldn't. Again, she sees her position in society as being so unimportant that she doesn't even think that she's worthy of recognition. Whereas Marlene is very important and very powerful, and so Mrs. Kidd feels it would be natural for her to remember Marlene. So from here we can infer that Mrs. Kidd believes her position in society to be lower than that of Marlene's, and that's a really important thing for us to understand in terms of looking at the dichotomy between the two characters. So could you please copy out these quotations and then write down what they reflect about Mrs. Kidd's position in society, or feelings about her own position in society. Off you go. Okay, so I know that you guys love my writing on the board. Thank you, Ellie. So she immediately establishes a dichotomy here as well when she says, I know office work isn't like housework. So by juxtaposing those two ideas and contrasting them, Churchill reflects the different spheres that the two women adopt. Whilst Marlene adopts a working sphere, Mrs. Kidd very much is confined to the domestic sphere, and she shows the difference between those two. Mrs. Kidd almost feels like her work, housework, domestic work, running a home, isn't as important as office work. Again, reflecting her feelings of her position in society. So you might like to add that to your answer now. Hopefully in your answer as well, you've reflected this idea of the continual apologies. Hopefully you've noted something about how Marlene seems to hold the power in the situation, and that's reflected through the interruption as well. So in your answer now, if you haven't already, I'd like you to examine methods employed by Churchill in these quotations that demonstrate the difference between the two women and the imbalance in power between them. So the exchange between them begins quite pleasantly. Mrs. Kidd shows her submissive nature towards Marlene, and she's very apologetic. However, it quickly turns sour between the two women, as reflected in the next little extract. Okay, so hopefully we've answered that question, and now we've added information about methods used by Churchill to help us to answer that question. Okay, so Mrs. Kidd starts to state her case about why she's come to see Marlene. She says, "I'm referring to you being appointed managing director instead of Howard." And then she says, "What's it going to do to him working for a woman? I think if it was a man, he'd get over it, like as if it was something normal." And then she says, "But he's got a family to support. He's got 3 children. It's only fair." This shows Mrs. Kidd's reflection on the world, her outlook on the world about how men should be the one to work and men should be the one with the powers, reflecting that more traditional patriarchal view of a society. So she can't comprehend the idea that Marlene, as a woman, has been promoted over Howard. Now, I think this particular bit at the end here, "it's only fair," is particularly interesting. Because as a viewer now, we would watch this play and we would think that actually fairness would dictate that whoever was better for the job, be it a man or a woman, would get the job. But Mrs. Kidd reflects those patriarchal views, that it's only fair that a man should be appointed over a woman, because in her view, a man's role in life, whilst a woman would stay at home and look after the house, a man's role would be to support their family and provide for their family in a financial way. And so here we see that Churchill presents us almost, or presents this point in time as almost like a crossroads. So women's roles are changing and they are entering the working world, but this leaves us to question how this impacts upon men and their roles in life. If their role traditionally before this was to be the supporter, the breadwinner, the person who goes out and earns the money for the family, if women are able to do that now, where does that leave men like Howard, who felt that that was their position in life? And are men in some way disenfranchised by this idea of women in power? So Mrs. Kidd, as I said, reflects that more traditional, the older values, and at how we're at this point in time where you still have men who are trying to provide for their families, but now they're competing with women as well. Where does this leave people who are still adopting that more patriarchal structure within their family? This point here as well, if it was a man, he'd get over it as something normal. Suggests that for Mrs. Kidd, this situation is entirely abnormal. So have a think now, using the evidence that we've just discussed. And again, I'd like you to support your answer with methods from the text, as I've just gone through with you. You might want to go back in the video to get those methods. But what can we infer about Mrs. Kidd's ideologies about life? And have a think about that. Okay, so Mrs. Kidd then says, "It's me that bears the brunt. I'm not the one that's been promoted. I put him first every inch of the way, and now what do I get? You women this, you women that." What can we infer from this particular quotation about Mrs. Kidd's life? What is her life like? Because Churchill doesn't position us to believe that being the new woman and rejecting relationships is the ideal. Nor does she show us that being Mrs. Kidd, that adopting that domestic role and the older traditional values are the ideal either. Churchill seems to suggest that we want to strive for somewhere in between the two, where women can balance domestic roles with a working role as well. But what do we learn about Mrs. Kidd's life? Is Mrs. Kidd's life idealistic? Is that what we should strive for or not? Is she happy, or is there a sense of unhappiness? And I think a key thing to take away from the play is that actually none of the characters achieve happiness. They may achieve success, but is success in a career, is that linked with happiness? And we're forced to think about what actually do we want from society and from feminism as well. Okay, and then the exchange between the two women moves away from something that's quite pleasant to something very unpleasant. Mrs. Kidd says of Marlene, "You're one of those ball breakers, that's what you are. You'll end up miserable and lonely." And again, she's interrupted by Marlene while she says that, reflecting the power imbalance between the two characters. She also says, "You're not natural." Okay, reflecting that traditional notion that the natural role for women is to be a mother and to adopt that domestic sphere. And the older traditional ways of thinking from the patriarchal structure of previous societies would be that any woman that deviates away from that isn't natural. And again, we see, because we're not positioned to particularly like Mrs. Kidd or support what she's saying, nor are we supposed to like Marlene and the way that she reacts. So again, we're seeing that there's no ideal way of thinking here, and that this crossroad in society kind of needs to find a way to merge together so that women can work harmoniously. So absolutely, there's conflict between women who still favour those more traditional roles, and conflict between women who go into the working world. And we're not supposed to be on either woman's side. We're supposed to consider that there should be some middle ground where the two can exist harmoniously, or where women aren't given such black and white choices, where they can balance between the two. This bit here also links into our learning that we did in class about the language of gender. So previously we'd seen female genitalia referred to as demonstrating weakness, being used in a derogatory way. So particularly when Joyce called Angie an effing rotten little C-bomb, demonstrating the derogatory use of language associated with female genitalia, whereas the language associated with male genitalia seems to be linked to bravery, courage, strength. So this was again highlighted when Wynne or Nell, I can't remember which one, they both blur into one for me, said, Marlene's got far more balls than Howard. And then Mrs. Kidd calls Marlene a ball breaker. This idea that male genitalia is associated with power. And I think Churchill's intentionally chosen that language to reflect the way that even our language emphasizes this patriarchal structure of society and how that's wrong. And I think that's still poignant today, isn't it, when we discuss this and when we discuss the terms associated and expletives associated with genitalia and how they reflect very different things between the male and the female genitalia. Okay. So one of Churchill's big ideas is that the rise of the new woman creates conflict between women. What conflicts exist between the women in the text? And I don't just want you to think about the obvious example we've just explored of Marlene and Mrs. Kidd. You can write them down as a conflict. But what other conflicts are there between women? And include Act 3 in your ideas here as well. Write a list of the conflicts between the women in the text, and then next to it write down what has caused the conflict. Why are the two women that you've noted conflicted? Off you go. Okay, so we're going to move forward now to our study of representation of men. So there are no male characters in the text, and that is to be noted, and that was a conscious choice by Churchill. But lots of men are mentioned in the text. I want you, first and foremost, just to write a list of any men that you can remember that are mentioned in the text. So there are no male characters, but men are mentioned. Okay, off you go, write your list. Okay, now you've written your list, I want you to think about Churchill's representation of men in the play. What do they all have in common? So you might have written down Howard, you might have written down the Emperor that Lady Nijo was attached to, Patient Griselda's husband. In Act 3, Joyce talks about her own husband. We also have references to Joyce and Marlene's father as well. They were all mentioned. What do they all have in common? Are any of them represented, or are any males in the text represented in a positive light? The only one I can slightly think of is the Doctor with Isabella in Act 1, but he wasn't presented in an overly positive light, just in kind of a way that he wasn't really mentioned that much, I guess, positively or negatively. So one of the reasons when we discussed, I don't know if you can think right back when we discussed feminism and the whole idea of feminism and why people didn't like to identify themselves as a feminist, even though feminism just means basically the belief that men and women are equal, and everyone should believe that men and women are equal. And so really we should all be confident in identifying as feminists, but people don't want to, because feminism at some point in time became synonymous with man-hating. And I think this idea of all of the males in the text being represented in that negative way is Churchill's way of alluding to how sometimes feminism can become synonymous with men hating, and that's not what it should be about. It should be about just the strife for equality between the genders. Okay, so there's our list of men then. Let's have a think about them. So Mr. Kidd, he's presented as not treating Mrs. Kidd very nicely. He rants and raves to her. He struggles to adapt to this situation where Marlene has been promoted over him and thinks it's unfair, even though it's entirely fair that if she's the better person for the job, she should get the job. And so he's presented in quite a negative light, and someone who has been emasculated by the rise of the new woman. The Emperor and Griselda's husband, definitely not presented in a positive light with the way that they treat them. And Marlene's father as well. Marlene's father was an alcoholic who made all of their lives very miserable. So again, that's not presented in a particularly positive light. Okay, so that's the end of our study of Act 2 then. Hopefully you've made some good notes, and if you still have any questions about Act 2, please just let me know through email or through a message on Show My Homework. Okay, thank you.